"I know what you are," the child said to the new sheriff. And then she disappeared that very night. The star felt heavier than it should have when Thomas Crow pinned it to his chest. 6 points of tin catching the late afternoon sun, throwing light back at the dusty street like accusations. His fingers shook just a little as he pressed the metal through the worn fabric of his vest. Not from fear. He'd stopped feeling that particular emotion 3 towns back. The trembling came from something deeper, something that lived in the space between who he was and who he was pretending to be. Redemption Creek stretched out before him like a prayer written in sand and broken dreams. Main Street ran straight as a gunshot between 2 rows of sun-bleached buildings that seemed to lean into each other for support. The saloon sat on one corner, its bat-wing doors swinging lazy in the hot breeze. Across the way, a general store displayed bolts of cloth in its window like colorful bandages for wounds that couldn't heal. At the far end, a church steeple pointed toward heaven with the desperation of a drowning man reaching for the surface. The town council had gathered to watch him take the oath. 5 men in ill-fitting suits, their faces carved by wind and disappointment. Mayor Henderson, a soft man with hard eyes, had done the talking. Asked no questions about where Thomas came from or why he'd answer their advertisement for a sheriff. In towns like Redemption Creek, asking too many questions was like looking too close at a man's cards. It could get you hurt. "We need law here," Henderson had said, mopping his forehead with a handkerchief that had seen better days. "Cattle rustlers, horse thieves, men who take what ain't theirs." He'd paused then, studying Thomas with the kind of look that suggested he knew more than he was saying. "Of course, we also need a man who understands that sometimes the law ain't written in books. Sometimes it's written in blood." Thomas had nodded, said the right words, raised his right hand to swear an oath he had no intention of keeping. The badge had come with the job, along with a small room above the jail and $40 a month. It was enough to disappear into, which was all he needed. But as he stood there in the dying light, feeling the weight of that star against his chest, he noticed her. The girl couldn't have been more than 12, though her eyes held the kind of knowing that came from seeing too much too young. She sat on the steps of the general store, her dress patched and clean, her bare feet dirty from the dust. Dark hair hung in 2 braids down her back, and her skin had the sun-touched brown of someone who spent more time outdoors than in. She watched him with the intensity of a hawk studying a field mouse. Most of the townspeople had wandered off after the ceremony, back to their daily business of surviving another day in a place God seemed to have forgotten. But the girl remained, her gaze never leaving his face. Thomas felt something cold move through his chest, a recognition he couldn't name. He walked toward her, his boots raising small clouds of dust with each step. The sound echoed off the empty buildings like gunshots, though he knew that was just his guilt talking. Everything sounded like violence when you'd done what he'd done. "Afternoon," he said, tipping his hat. Up close, he could see that her eyes were green as winter grass, and they held depths that shouldn't exist in someone so young. "I am Sheriff Crow." She tilted her head, studying him like he was a puzzle she was working to solve. For a long moment, she said nothing. The silence stretched between them, filled with the buzz of flies and the distant lowing of cattle. Thomas found himself holding his breath, though he couldn't say why. Finally, she spoke. Her voice was soft but clear, each word falling into the space between them like stones into still water. "I know what you are." The words hit him like a physical blow. Thomas felt his heart stutter in his chest, his mouth go dry as desert sand. Behind those 5 simple words lay a weight of understanding that made his knees weak. She couldn't know. There was no way she could know. He'd been careful, covered his tracks, buried his past in 3 different states. "What's your name, child?" He managed, his voice rougher than he intended. "Emma," she said, never taking those green eyes off his face. "Emma Hartwell. My mama died last winter." "My pa," she shrugged, a gesture too old for her years. "He ain't been the same since." Thomas crouched down, so they were at eye level, trying to read whatever it was she saw in him. "And what is it you think I am, Emma Hartwell?" She leaned forward slightly, and for a moment he caught a scent of soap and dust, and something else, something that reminded him of his sister back home, before everything went wrong. Before he became the kind of man who ran from town to town with other men's blood under his fingernails. "You're a killer," she whispered, so quiet he almost missed it. But not the bad kind. Not anymore. The world seemed to stop moving. Even the wind held its breath. Thomas stared into those two knowing eyes and saw his reflection there. Not the man he was trying to be, but the man he'd been forced to become. The man who'd pulled the trigger on Johnny Kellerman outside a saloon in Abilene. The man who'd watched the light go out of another human being's eyes and felt nothing but relief that it was over. Ow! The word came out cracked and broken. Emma smiled then, sad and small. "You got the same look my pa got after he killed them men who hurt Mama. Like you're carrying something heavy that you can't put down." She stood up, brushing dust from her dress. "But you ain't like him. You let it make him mean. You're trying to make it right." Before Thomas could respond, before he could ask her what she meant or how she could possibly understand, Emma turned and walked away. She moved like smoke, there one moment and gone the next, disappearing around the corner of the general store and leaving him alone with his thoughts and the weight of a star that felt like it might pull him straight through the earth. That night, Thomas lay on his narrow bed above the jail, staring at the ceiling and listening to the sounds of the town settling into sleep. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to the moon, its voice full of loneliness and longing. He thought about Emma's words, about the look in her eyes that said she'd seen his soul and found it wanting, but not damned. He must have dozed because the next thing he knew, sunlight was streaming through his window and someone was pounding on his door. Thomas stumbled downstairs, still half asleep, to find Mayor Henderson standing on the boardwalk with his face pale as fresh snow. "She's gone," Henderson said, his words tumbling over each other. "Emma Hartwell. Her father came looking for her this morning. Said she never came home last night. We've looked everywhere, Sheriff. Everywhere." Thomas felt something cold settle in his stomach, heavier even than the badge on his chest. He thought about the girl's knowing eyes, about the way she'd seen straight through him to the truth he carried like a tumor in his chest. He thought about her words, "I know what you are," and wondered if knowing had been enough to get her killed. The desert stretched out beyond the town limits, vast and unforgiving, full of places where a small girl could disappear forever and leave nothing behind but questions and regret. By the third day, the whispers had grown loud enough to hear. Thomas stood at the window of his small room, watching the people of Redemption Creek move through their morning routines like actors in a play they'd rehearsed too many times. Mrs. Patterson swept her porch with sharp, angry strokes. Old Pete limped past the jail without his usual nod of greeting. Even the dogs seemed to avoid looking in his direction. The search parties had given up yesterday. 20 men had combed the hills and gullies around town, calling Emma's name until their voices cracked and died in the dry air. They'd found nothing. Not a scrap of cloth, not a footprint, not even a strand of dark hair caught on a thorn bush. It was as if the desert had opened its mouth and swallowed her whole. Thomas had searched too, though he'd done it alone. While the townspeople gathered in groups, sharing theories and suspicions, he'd ridden out before dawn each day on his horse, a tired sorrel mare named Dust. He'd followed game trails and wagon ruts, checked every cave and abandoned mine shaft within a day's ride. Each time, he'd returned empty-handed, carrying only the weight of failure and the growing certainty that he was losing more than just a missing child. He was losing himself. The knock on his door came just as he was strapping on his gun belt, preparing for another day of searching. Mayor Henderson stood in the hallway, flanked by 2 other council members, Jim Morrison, who owned the feed store, and Dr. Welsh, whose hands shook these days from too much whiskey and too little sleep. "Sheriff," Henderson said, though the title sounded strained coming from his mouth. "We need to talk." Thomas stepped back, letting them into the small room. It smelled of dust and loneliness with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a chair that had seen better decades. The men filled the space with their bulk and their barely contained anger. 3 days, Morrison said without preamble. His face was red from the sun, and something deeper, the kind of frustration that came from helplessness. 3 days, and you ain't found so much as a hint of that girl. I'm still looking, Thomas replied, his voice steady despite the churning in his gut. Are you? Dr. Welsh's words came out slurred, though it was barely past 8 in the morning. Because some folks are starting to wonder if maybe you know more about this than you're letting on. The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Thomas felt something cold move through his chest. Not fear exactly, but recognition. This was how it always started. The questions, the sideways looks, the slow burn of suspicion that would eventually consume everything in its path. You think I hurt that child? He asked quietly. Henderson shifted his weight from one foot to the other. We don't know what to think, Sheriff. You show up in town, pin on a badge, and the next day, a little girl disappears. You can see how that might look. Thomas could see exactly how it looked. A stranger with secrets, running from something he wouldn't name. A man who wore his past like a scar across his soul, trying to hide behind a tin star that meant nothing. In their place, he might have wondered the same thing. I'll find her, he said, knowing even as the words left his mouth that they sounded hollow. You better, Morrison warned. Because if you don't, this town's going to find itself a new sheriff, one way or another. After they left, Thomas sat on his bed and stared at his hands. They were good hands, strong and steady, calloused from years of hard work. But they were also the hands that had pulled the trigger on Johnny Kellerman. The hands that had ended a life, even if it was in defense of something precious. Emma had seen that in him somehow, had looked past the badge to the killer underneath. Maybe she'd been right to disappear. He rode out again that afternoon, pushing dust farther than he'd gone before. The desert stretched endlessly in all directions, a sea of sage and sand broken only by the occasional Joshua tree reaching toward the merciless sky. The heat pressed down like a weight, making the horizon shimmer and dance. It was near a dry creek bed, maybe 15 miles from town, that he found the first real sign. Wagon tracks, but not the usual kind. These were narrow, light, made by wheels that had been muffled somehow, wrapped in cloth or leather to muffle the sound. The tracks led north, toward the Badlands where decent people didn't go, where men who lived outside the law made their homes among the rocks and rattlesnakes. Thomas dismounted and knelt beside the tracks, running his fingers through the disturbed earth. The wagon had passed this way recently, maybe 2 days ago. There were horse prints too, several sets, all shod. Men on horseback, following or leading the wagon. His blood turned to ice when he saw the small footprint pressed into the soft dirt near the creek bank. A child's bare foot, the same size as Emma's. The trail led deeper into the wasteland, through country that grew harder and more hostile with each mile. Thomas followed it like a man possessed, his eyes scanning the ground for every broken twig, every disturbed stone. The sun began its descent toward the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of blood and fire. As darkness crept across the land, he made camp in a shallow cave, building no fire for fear of being seen. The night sounds of the desert surrounded him. The yip of coyotes, the rustle of small creatures hunting and being hunted, the whisper of wind through stone. But underneath it all, he heard something else. The echo of Emma's words. I know what you are. She'd seen the truth of him that day on the steps of the general store, seen the blood on his hands and the weight on his soul. But she'd also seen something else, something he was only beginning to understand. She'd seen potential. The possibility that a man could carry his sins without being crushed by them. That redemption might be found not in running from the past, but in facing the future with different choices. The question was whether he'd find her in time to prove her right. As he lay on his bedroll, staring up at stars that seemed cold and distant as judgment, Thomas made a promise to the darkness. He would find Emma Hartwell. He would bring her home safely. And if anyone had hurt her, if anyone had taken advantage of her innocence, he would show them exactly what kind of man he truly was. The desert kept its secrets well, but some secrets were worth fighting for. The trail of broken things led Thomas deeper into country that seemed forgotten by God. A torn piece of blue cloth hung from a mesquite branch, fluttering in a morning breeze like a prayer flag. 20 yards farther, he found a child's shoe, brown leather, worn thin at the toe, small enough to fit in his palm. His heart hammered against his ribs as he dismounted and searched the ground around it, looking for signs of struggle, for blood, for anything that might tell him Emma's fate. What he found instead was hope. The shoe sat beside the wagon tracks, placed deliberately on a flat stone where it couldn't be missed. Not lost in panic or torn away in violence, but left as a marker, a message for anyone smart enough to follow. Emma was still alive, and she was still thinking. The tracks led up a steep-sided canyon where ancient water had carved deep channels in the red rock. Thomas led Dust carefully along the narrow path, his hand resting on his gun as he watched the rim above for any sign of movement. The walls closed in around them, creating shadows that seemed to breathe with menace. It was in those shadows that he heard the voices. "Told you the girl would bring trouble," one man was saying, his words echoing off the stone walls. "Should have left her in town and lose $50. Another voice, rougher, with an accent Thomas couldn't place. "No, that little one's got spirit. Some folks pay extra for spirit." Thomas felt ice form in his veins. He dismounted and crept forward on foot, leaving Dust tied to a stunted pine. The voices grew clearer as he moved deeper into the canyon, and with them came the smell of smoke from a cooked fire and something else, unwashed bodies and fear. The canyon opened into a small clearing where 3 men sat around a dying fire. Their horses stood tethered nearby, heads hanging in the heat. Beyond them, barely visible in the shadows of the far wall, was the mouth of an old mine shaft. A wooden sign beside it read, "Lucky Strike," played out 1871 in faded letters. Thomas crouched behind a boulder and studied the men. The one doing most of the talking was thin as a rail, with a face like a hawk and clothes that had seen better years. His companions were cut from rougher cloth, one built like a bull, with arms thick as fence posts, the other small and wiry with nervous eyes that never stayed still for long. "When's Garrett coming back?" the nervous one asked, spitting into the dirt. "Tomorrow, maybe the day after," Hawkface replied. "Depends on how many buyers he finds in Tucson. Could be we hit the motherlode with this batch." Thomas's stomach turned to lead. He'd heard stories about men like these, traders in human misery, who preyed on orphans and runaways. Children who wouldn't be missed, who could disappear into the darker corners of the territory and never be seen again. The thought of Emma in their hands made his vision blur with rage. But rage wouldn't save her. He needed to be smart. He waited until the men settled into their afternoon rest, then began working his way around the edge of the clearing toward the mine shaft. Every step had to be silent, every breath controlled. One mistake would mean death for all of them. The mouth of the shaft was cool and dark, a wound in the earth that breathed stale air and old disappointments. Thomas slipped inside, his hand on his gun, moving by feel along the rough-hewn walls. Somewhere ahead, he could hear the soft sound of children crying. The shaft curved to the right, then opened into a wider chamber where pale light filtered down from a crack in the ceiling above. In that thin light, Thomas saw them. 3 children huddled together in the far corner, dirty and frightened but alive. Emma sat in the middle, her arms around 2 smaller ones, a boy who couldn't have been more than 6 and a girl even younger. When she saw Thomas, her green eyes went wide, but she didn't cry out. Instead, she pressed a finger to her lips and pointed toward the entrance. Thomas nodded and crept closer, keeping his footsteps silent on the rocky floor. When he reached them, Emma leaned forward and whispered in his ear, her breath warm against his skin. 3 men. They took us 2 nights ago from the Murphy place. Said they had buyers waiting. Her voice was steady despite everything she'd been through. These little ones, they lost their folks to fever last month. Had nowhere else to go. Thomas looked at the younger children, saw the hollow fear in their eyes, and felt something break open in his chest. They were babies, innocents who'd done nothing to deserve this fate. The boy clutched a wooden horse carved from pine, holding it like a talisman against the darkness. The girl sucked her thumb and stared at Thomas with eyes too big for her face. "Can you get them out of here?" he whispered back. Emma nodded toward a narrow opening in the far wall. "There's another way out. Leads to the back of the canyon." "But Sheriff—" She paused, studying his face in the dim light. "I need to tell you something first." Thomas waited, his heart hammering. "I saw you in Abilene," she said quietly. 3 months ago. I was with my cousin's family, visiting. We were outside the Silver Dollar when you shot that man." The world seemed to tilt beneath Thomas's feet. Johnny Kellerman. The saloon. The moment that had changed everything. "Emma, Johnny Kellerman was his name," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "I heard folks talking after. Said he was a bad man. Said he hurt women and children for money. Said he killed a preacher's daughter in Kansas just for sport." Thomas closed his eyes, remembering. The girl had been 16, Sarah Mitchell, daughter of a circuit preacher. She'd trusted Johnny, let him walk her home from church one Sunday evening. They found her body 3 days later in a dry creek bed, broken and violated and left for the buzzards. "That's why you killed him, wasn't it?" Emma asked. "Not for money or meanness, but for justice. For that poor girl who couldn't fight back." Thomas opened his eyes and found her staring at him with that same knowing look she'd worn on the steps of the general store. In that moment, he saw himself reflected in her gaze. Not the killer he believed himself to be, but something else. Something harder to define. "Yes," he said simply. Emma nodded as if she'd known all along. "That's what I meant when I said you weren't the bad kind. You got blood on your hands, but it's the right kind of blood. The kind that protects folks who can't protect themselves." She reached out then and touched the star on his chest, her small fingers tracing its edges. "This badge don't make you a lawman, Sheriff Crow. But what you choose to do next might." Outside, one of the men called to his companions, his voice carrying into the mine shaft like a threat. Time was running out. Thomas looked at the 3 children, Emma with her old soul and fierce heart, the boy with his carved horse, the little girl with eyes like bruised flowers. They were counting on him now, trusting him to be the man Emma believed he could be. For the first time since Abilene, Thomas felt the weight of his badge settle into something that felt like purpose rather than pretense. They came for the children on a Tuesday morning when the sun hung like a copper coin in a sky bleached white with heat. Thomas stood on the porch of his jail, watching the dust cloud approach from the north. 5 riders moving fast, their horses lathered with sweat and purpose. He'd been expecting them since yesterday, when he'd brought Emma and the other 2 children back to town. Word traveled fast in the desert, carried on winds that whispered secrets to anyone who knew how to listen. Behind him, through the barred window of his jail, he could hear Emma humming softly to the younger children. She'd insisted they stay close, said she felt safer where she could see the star on his chest. The boy, whose name was Timothy, clutched his wooden horse and watched the door with eyes that had seen too much. The little girl, Sarah, named for a saint her dead mother had hoped, slept curled against Emma's side like a kitten seeking warmth. The riders pulled up in front of the jail in a cloud of dust and menace. Thomas recognized the hawk-faced man from the canyon, though now he wore a clean shirt and had made some effort to look respectable. The others were cut from the same cloth. Hard men who lived in the spaces between law and chaos, who made their living from other people's pain. "Sheriff," the hawk-faced man called out, touching the brim of his hat in a mockery of politeness. "Name's Jack Garrett. I believe you have something that belongs to me." Thomas stepped down from the porch, his boots hitting the dusty street with deliberate slowness. The badge on his chest caught the morning light, throwing it back like a challenge. Around them, the town was waking up. Shop owners swept their porches. Women hung laundry on lines that stretched between buildings like prayers written in cloth. Children played in the dirt streets, their laughter bright as birdsong. All of it would change in the next few minutes, depending on what kind of man Thomas chose to be. "Don't believe I have anything of yours, Garrett," Thomas said, his voice carrying in the still air. "Just some children who needed help." Garrett's smile was thin as a knife blade. Those children were legally purchased from their guardian. "Got the papers right here." He patted his vest pocket. "Of course, the law being what it is out here, Might be we can work something out. Man to man. Behind him, his companions shifted in their saddles. Thomas counted guns. 5 men, probably 2 weapons each, all of them positioned to control the street. These weren't amateurs. They'd done this before, used the thin veneer of legality to cover their crimes, relied on the isolation of places like Redemption Creek to keep their secrets. But they'd made one mistake. They'd come to his town. "Let me see those papers," Thomas said. Garrett dismounted, his movements careful and controlled. He reached into his vest and pulled out a folded document, yellowed with age and travel. Thomas took it, opened it, and read the words that might as well have been written in blood. The document was real enough, signed by a territorial judge in Tucson. It gave Jack Garrett legal guardianship of 3 orphan children, with permission to transport them to suitable homes in California. On paper, it looked legitimate. In reality, Thomas knew those suitable homes were brothels and work camps where children disappeared forever. "Interesting reading?" Garrett asked. Thomas folded the paper and handed it back. "Very interesting, especially the part where it's signed by Judge Morrison. Problem is, Judge Morrison died of consumption 6 months ago. I know because I was there when they buried him." The smile faded from Garrett's face like paint peeling from old wood. Around them, the street had grown quiet. People had stopped their morning routines to watch, sensing something in the air that tasted like gunpowder and justice. "You calling me a liar, Sheriff?" "I'm calling you a lot of things," Thomas replied. "But we'll start with kidnapper and work our way down to child killer." The words hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Behind Thomas, he could hear Emma's humming stop, replaced by the kind of silence that came before storms. He thought about what she'd said in the mine shaft, about the blood on his hands being the right kind, about choices and badges, and what it meant to stand between innocence and evil. Garrett's hand moved toward his gun, and time slowed to the pace of honey in winter. Thomas had killed before. In Abilene, when Johnny Kellerman had reached for his weapon in that saloon, Thomas had been faster. One shot, clean and final, ending a life that had caused too much pain to count. He'd felt nothing afterward but emptiness, as if he'd carved something vital out of his own soul along with Kellerman's life. This time was different. This time, when his hand moved to his Colt, when his fingers wrapped around the worn grip, he felt the weight of purpose instead of regret. He felt Emma's faith in him, solid as bedrock. He felt the trust of 2 smaller children who'd placed their futures in his hands. He felt the eyes of Redemption Creek watching him, waiting to see what kind of man their sheriff really was. The first shot came from Garrett, rushed and wild. It splintered the wooden post beside Thomas's head, sending splinters flying like angry wasps. The second shot came from Thomas, and it didn't miss. Garrett spun and fell, his gun tumbling into the dust. The other 4 men were reaching for their weapons when Thomas's voice cut through the air like a blade. "Next man who draws iron dies where he sits." They froze, hands halfway to their guns, caught between greed and survival. Thomas kept his Colt trained on the nearest rider, a bull-necked man with scars on his knuckles and death in his eyes. "Your boss is done," Thomas said quietly. "Question is whether you want to join him or ride out of here and find honest work." The bull-necked man spat into the dirt. "You think you're some kind of hero, lawman? You think saving a few brats makes you righteous." "I think," Thomas said, "that I'm tired of men like you hurting children. I think I'm tired of running from what needs to be done. And I think you've got about 10 seconds to make a choice before I make it for you." The silence stretched like a wire pulled tight. Then, one by one, the riders backed their horses away from the jail. The bull-necked man was last, his eyes promising future violence, but even he couldn't argue with the barrel of Thomas's gun. As they rode away, trailing dust and defeat, the people of Redemption Creek began to emerge from their buildings. Mayor Henderson approached cautiously, his face pale but determined. "Sheriff," he said, and this time the title sounded real. "Reckon we owe you an apology." Thomas holstered his gun and looked back at the jail where 3 children waited for him to keep them safe. Emma stood at the barred window, her green eyes bright with something that might have been pride. "No apology needed," Thomas said. "Just doing my job." The star on his chest caught the sunlight, throwing it back toward the endless sky, and for the first time since he'd pinned it there, it felt like it belonged.